Number 3 worst. James Buchanan. This crinkly, baby-faced twit is considered by many to be the worst US president of all time. And yeah, that's definitely understandable. First off, this is the only US president to not get married, which might be because he looks like a horrifying crossbreed between a baby and a bottle of hair gel. Secondly, his term lasted from 1857 to 1861, meaning this buffoon was in the White House right before the frickin' Civil War. And what did he do to stop it? Wait it out. As if the problems would magically solve themselves. While Kansas was breaking out in a mini-civil war, Buchanan did nothing. When the Dred Scott decision was made, which said Congress couldn't ban fricking slavery in the North or South, Buchanan did nothing. When the South fricking seceded near the end of 1860, Buchanan thought it was illegal. To prevent the South from seceding! All that this inept klutz did was ignore major issues, instead of, putting his foot down and telling the South, "No! Get your cotton-picking rear ends back here or else I'll brand you all with a cattle iron!" Buchanan just drifts off to his happy place and waits for the problems to fix themselves. If I had to summarize Buchanan's presidency in 3 words, it'd be, he did nothing. Because he didn't even accomplish anything good. Apart from leaving, that is. Number 3 best. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
For president, Ike, for president, Ike, for president, Ike, for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike. For president, hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
I don't just like Ike, I really like Ike. Dwight Ike Eisenhower held the presidency at a time where America was breaking into hysterics over catching potential commies red-handed and red-headed. Luckily, however, Eisenhower was the perfect man to keep the peace, withdrawing from the Korean War just months into office. Sure, no doubt Ike had his faults. He wielded the almighty nuke to threaten other countries into submission. He'd used the CIA to spy on them commie governments. The whole Suez crisis happened. And he was even hesitant to bestow desegregation on the country. But that didn't stop him from sending army troops to integrate a school in Little Rock after the torch-wielding white there protested it. Eisenhower signed some pretty dynamic legislature, like the National Defense Education Act, which expanded education on science and engineering, and the Interstate Highway Act, which spent billions of dollars on the construction of highways. That way, you can live life in the fast lane, instead of live life on the broken, battered, pothole-covered gravel path. Eisenhower also helped to create freaking NASA after the USSR launched a satellite. Unfortunately, it wasn't equipped with lock-on lasers, ballistic missiles, or free Wi-Fi, but hey, what can you do? Meanwhile, the economy is soaring higher than a crack addict, Ike's working to cool down Cold War tensions, and good times are booming like babies. Overall, Eisenhower is just such a pleasant and likable president with such a great term that he just had to go here. Number 2 worst. Andrew Jackson. Introducing Count Dracula. Jackson is by far one of my least favorite presidents. Not only does he look like a literal freaking ghoul, he is practically patronized today for pursuing crooked, dirt-poor policies, because this is the face worthy of the $20 bill. However, I'll try my best to explain why I feel the end results of his actions were unjust, so that I don't sound like a lunatic. He enacted the spoil system, which basically added Jackson's ugly cronies and a steamy plate of juicy corruption to the White House. I understand the Democrats were being pushy about who would get what political position, but in the end, Jackson was the one to comply to peer pressure, and next thing you know, the toothy Samuel Swartrout is stealing $1 million from the New York City Custom House. Jackson also took a sledgehammer to the second bank of the US, which is both good and bad. On one hand, it's essentially an early version of trust busting, which is my favorite kind of busting. On the other hand, it was a bank. So after Jackson exited office, the economy collapsed. And, most controversial of all, the Indian Removal Act, the forced removal of Native Americans from their homes. Now, Jackson wasn't the first guy or the last guy to kill a bunch of Indians. In fact, he wanted to put an end to the land squabbles between the Indians and those pesky whites. But the way he executed it, yeesh. Yeah, it was a lot less bloody than what many white settlers were sadistically thinking. However, that doesn't make the outcome good, necessarily. But the act has its pros and cons, right? On the plus side, it evaded full-blown wide-scale warfare, created a band of Seminoles who now gamble in the Everglades, and killed only a couple thousand Indians instead of potentially a lot more. But on the flip side, it flagged the start of the continual push of Indian territories westwards, led to a couple small-scale Indian wars, and essentially resulted in 4,000 Indians dying on the Trail of Tears because they were forcefully escorted out of their rightful homes because they were in the way of land-hungry expansionists. So yeah, your call if it's bad or not, really. Sure, Jackson represented the common man, somewhat solved the nullification crisis, and expanded executive power by misusing it. But in the end, he's a corrupt crony who evicts Indians for not paying their mortgages and has the face of a polar bear with alcoholism. Put Pierce on the $20 bill instead! That sexy face deserves to be on money! Number 2 best, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, FDR, the economy's been slitting its wrists for the past 4 years. 1 out of 4 Americans are suffering from severe job loss, and sitting President Herbert Hoover somehow managed to get renominated despite failing to solve this predicament. What do you have to say about that? I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 5th cousin of Theodore Roosevelt and 5th cousin of my wife, promise a New Deal. What now, boss? New Deal! Okay, boss, unemployment has actually started shrinking for the first time in years. The CCC just put out a bunch of forest fires, Social Security checks are being passed out, and Republicans are howling like banshees. So far, it seems we're making a healthy recovery. What now, boss? More New Deal! Okay, boss, here's a complete list of your New Deal reforms, here's a graph of unemployment history, and here's a cup of coffee. What? Hello? Oh, sure thing. What was that about, boss? Oh, Pearl Harbor just got bombed and crazy dictators in Germany, Italy, and Japan are waging a huge war in Europe and East Asia, and Britain is pretty much running on pure willpower and they need our help. Well, what are you gonna— We're killing those motherfucking dictators! Well, boss, the Germans are nearing surrender, the Japanese are fighting hard but losing steam, employment is spectacularly high, and the ancient 2-term tradition has been booted out the window. How do you plan to serve your 4th term, boss? An intracerebral hemorrhage. What is that? And the number 1 worst president is Andrew Johnson. Who but to take Abraham Lincoln's place right after the Civil War than a pro-Southern Democrat? Andrew Johnson. Andrew frickin' Johnson. Responsible for the constant delaying of Reconstruction for the freed slaves, the formal pardoning of all Confederate leaders, and overall being a greedy, racist, crooked, white piece of junk. Who put this man on the presidential ticket right next to frickin' Lincoln? Why did his scheduled assassin chicken out? Why the frick did Andrew Johnson even get to call himself the president? But Ace, you say, cocking your head, he couldn't have been that bad, right? Do you even know fricking history? Andrew Johnson could not have picked a worse time to be in office. The U.S. just won a fricking war against these human traffickers in the fricking South, and their reward is a pro-Southern president who will viciously stamp a veto on any piece of legislature that benefits the African Americans in any way. Extend the Freedmen's Bureau to educate more freed slaves? Veto. Pass the Civil Rights Bill to acknowledge equality? Veto! Override! Grant any basic form of liberty or freedom to African Americans in any way whatsoever? Veto, veto, veto! As well as that, instead of hanging the Confederate leaders by their own whips as they deserved, President Ku Klux decides to grant a royal pardon to all of them. And Johnson even allowed the Deep South to create black codes, aka an awkward puberty stage between slavery and Jim Crow laws. Eventually, this screwy man's stupidity led to him being the first president to have an impeachment trial, but just escaping fate by 1 vote. In conclusion, Andrew Johnson was a racist president right after Abraham Lincoln. And that's all you need to know. Number 1 best. Now, think of your favorite U.S. president. Then comment it, I have a life contract with the gods that I need to fulfill. When most people think of their favorite president, they might think of who did the most for this country. Lincoln preserved the Union, Kennedy sent out the Peace Corps, Clinton co-wrote this book, etc. But my favorite president is, essentially, a man with adventure, spirit, and a plush bear named after him. And that president is the rough-riding, trust-busting, square-dealing, big-sticking, bull-moosing, park-making, canal-building— okay, you get the idea. Teddy Roosevelt! This man is freaking epic. He spent years building himself in the Dakota Badlands, went on a Brazilian science expedition, took a bullet to the chest but still read a speech before seeking help. Not what your typical run-of-the-mill human being usually does. Teddy did loads for America, particularly because he was the first president of the Progressive Era, aka Make America Great Again, on all kinds of drugs. First off, Roosevelt was an avid supporter of his square deal for labor, Roosevelts have a thing for deals, and did this by bringing better conditions for laborers performing a coal strike and busting approximately 44 bad trusts and what he called trust busting. TR also signed progressive legislature like these two acts, which limited the bulking octopus known as the Railroad Trust, and these two acts, which make sure your Mickey D's hamburgers don't have razor blades or deceased rodents in them. Yeah, I think this act needs an update. Most notably and importantly though, Roosevelt preserved about 230 million acres of land for national parks, national forests, bird reserves, and frickin' more. Just thank you, Mr. Roosevelt. Not to mention, he was the first president to invite an African American to the White House, ordered construction of the Panama Canal, activated his big stick policy in Latin America, and even got a Nobel Peace Prize for working out the dinks in the relationship between Russia and Japan. In my opinion, this man was a freaking amazing leader, park ranger, soldier, author, mustache rocker, and progressive era president, helping to round about a new era in history to address problems in a gilded society. Seriously, we need another Roosevelt in office.